How does one company dominate an industry without ever being officially called a monopoly? In heavy equipment, the answer is not found in a single machine, lawsuit, or takeover, but in a pattern that unfolded quietly over decades. Caterpillar Incorporated did not simply outbuild its rivals. It outlasted them, absorbed them, boxed them out, or made survival so difficult that collapse became inevitable. This story is not about innovation alone, and it is not a celebration of success. It is about power exercised through consolidation, distribution, politics, and timing. Competitors fought back, regulators investigated, and alternatives briefly survived, but the balance kept shifting in one direction. What follows is not a victory story. It is a record of how competition disappeared without a final verdict, and how dominance became normal before anyone could stop it. Caterpillar Incorporated, the monopoly that was never called one. The rise of Caterpillar Incorporated into the dominant force in heavy equipment was not an accident of innovation alone, but the product of aggressive consolidation, pricing pressure, and political leverage that reshaped entire markets. From the mid-20th century onward, Caterpillar expanded beyond engines and tractors into mining, construction, and earth-moving, steadily reducing the space available for competitors. By the time globalization accelerated in the 1970s, the company already controlled distribution, financing, and service at a scale few rivals could challenge. Caterpillar's power rested first on vertical integration. The company did not simply sell machines, it sold parts, maintenance contracts, financing, and resale pathways through tightly controlled dealer networks. Independent dealers were locked into exclusive agreements that restricted them from carrying competing brands. This structure ensured customers remained dependent long after the initial sale, while rivals struggled to match lifecycle support without comparable capital. Pricing strategy became another weapon. Caterpillar frequently undercut competitors in key bids, absorbing short-term losses to secure long-term market presence. Internal industry complaints alleged predatory pricing in mining trucks, bulldozers, and excavators, especially during downturns when weaker firms could not survive prolonged price pressure. While rarely proven in court, the pattern forced several manufacturers into mergers or exits. Acquisitions further concentrated power. Rather than competing head-to-head indefinitely, Caterpillar absorbed rivals or their product lines, neutralizing threats while inheriting patents and customer bases. Critics argued these deals reduced meaningful competition, even when regulators approved them individually. Over time, market diversity eroded not through one decisive takeover but through cumulative absorption. Government relationships played a critical role. Caterpillar benefited from defense contracts, infrastructure spending, and export financing that stabilized revenues during recessions. Trade policy also mattered. During disputes with Japanese manufacturers in the 1980s, Caterpillar publicly framed competition as unfair dumping, lobbying for tariffs and political pressure. This strategy constrained foreign rivals while reinforcing domestic dominance. Antitrust scrutiny existed, but consequences were limited. Investigations in the United States and Europe examined dealer exclusivity and pricing behavior, yet rarely resulted in structural remedies. Regulators often treated heavy equipment as a cyclical, capital-intensive industry, where scale was considered necessary. This assumption allowed concentration to persist, even as competitors disappeared. Labor practices added another layer of controversy. Prolonged strikes during the 1980s and 1990s highlighted tensions between cost control and workforce stability. Caterpillar relocated production, hired replacement workers, and leveraged global manufacturing to weaken unions. Critics argued these moves reduced labor bargaining power industry-wide, indirectly lowering costs in ways smaller competitors could not replicate. Environmental and ethical criticisms followed expansion. Mining equipment enabled large-scale extraction projects linked to deforestation, displacement, and pollution. While Caterpillar maintained compliance with regulations, Activists argued the company externalized social costs while consolidating profits. Smaller manufacturers, lacking political insulation, faced higher relative risk when controversies arose. By the early 2000s, Caterpillar's dominance appeared normalized. Customers described a lack of genuine alternatives for certain equipment classes, particularly in mining. Dependence on parts availability and dealer coverage discouraged switching, even when prices rose. The result was a market shaped less by open competition than by structural lock-in. Caterpillar was never legally declared a monopoly, yet its behavior reflected monopoly power. Through integration, pricing pressure, acquisitions, political leverage, and distribution control, the company narrowed competitive space without triggering decisive regulatory action. The controversy is not whether Caterpillar built superior machines, but whether the market ever truly had a chance to choose otherwise. International controversies intensified scrutiny. In Europe, dealers and competitors accused Caterpillar of enforcing territorial restrictions that limited cross-border sales, prompting investigations and fines related to distribution practices. In developing markets, complaints focused on pricing disparities and parts markups that inflated lifetime ownership costs. Tax strategies also drew criticism, particularly corporate restructurings that shifted intellectual property and profits to lower tax jurisdictions, reducing liabilities while maintaining public infrastructure benefits. Defenders argued legality and efficiency. Critics argued competitive distortion and unfair advantage. Together, these disputes reinforced perceptions that Caterpillar operated beyond normal market discipline, insulated by scale, political access, and customer dependence rather than constrained by open rivalry. These conflicts did not produce a single decisive judgment, but their accumulation shaped an industry where exit was common and entry rare. The absence of a final ruling became part of the outcome itself. Bucyrus International. Bought, absorbed, erased. For much of the 20th century, Bucyrus International stood as one of the most influential names in surface mining machinery. Founded in the late 19th century, the company built massive draglines, shovels, and rotary blast hole drills that defined how coal and mineral extraction operated across North America and beyond. Yet by 2011, Bucyrus ceased to exist as an independent company, absorbed entirely by Caterpillar Inc. in a deal that fundamentally reshaped the global mining equipment market. The acquisition, announced in 2010 and completed in 2011, was presented publicly as a strategic alignment. Caterpillar sought to expand aggressively into large-scale mining equipment, an area where it lagged behind rivals in ultra-class shovels and draglines. Bucyrus possessed precisely what Caterpillar lacked: specialized mining technology, deep customer relationships, and decades of engineering knowledge in equipment too large and complex for rapid internal development. Behind the strategic framing, the deal raised immediate concerns within the mining industry. Bucyrus was not a struggling company in collapse. It had absorbed its own rival, Marion Power Shovel, earlier in the 2000s, consolidating a large share of the surface mining equipment market. When Caterpillar purchased Bucyrus for billions of dollars, it eliminated one of the last major independent competitors in high-capacity mining machinery. The integration process was swift and unforgiving. Bucyrus branding was phased out, product lines were rebranded under the Caterpillar name, and corporate identity vanished within a short period. While Caterpillar promised continuity, many Bucyrus facilities faced restructuring, workforce reductions, or shifts in production priorities. Engineers and specialists who had built careers within Bucyrus suddenly found themselves operating inside a vastly larger corporate structure, with different incentives and cost pressures. Customers were among the first to feel the effects. Mining operators who had previously negotiated between Caterpillar and Bucyrus now faced a consolidated supplier with greater leverage over pricing, service contracts, and parts availability. Industry complaints emerged regarding rising parts as costs and reduced flexibility in service agreements. While Caterpillar denied exploiting monopoly power, the loss of direct competition altered bargaining dynamics in a market already dominated by a few manufacturers. Regulatory scrutiny followed, but with limited impact. Antitrust authorities reviewed the acquisition and ultimately approved it, arguing that competition from other global manufacturers remained sufficient. Critics countered that such analysis underestimated the importance of specialization. In ultra-large mining equipment, switching suppliers is not trivial. Machines operate for decades, and fleets are standardized around parts, training, and maintenance systems. Removing Bucharest as an independent option effectively locked many customers deeper into Caterpillar ecosystems. The acquisition also intensified labor and community tensions. Bucyrus facilities in the United States had historically supported regional economies built around heavy manufacturing. Post-acquisition restructuring reduced employment stability, as Caterpillar optimized operations globally. Decisions were driven by shareholder value and scale efficiency rather than preserving legacy industrial communities. Workers described the transition as an erasure rather than a merger. From an industry perspective, the Bucyrus acquisition marked a turning point. It demonstrated that even highly specialized manufacturers were vulnerable to absorption once market leaders decided to buy rather than compete. Smaller firms lacked the capital to resist prolonged pricing pressure or to survive in niches increasingly controlled by multinational giants. The controversy was not centered on legality alone, but on consequence. Bucyrus did not fail through mismanagement or technological stagnation. It disappeared because its strengths made it valuable enough to eliminate as a rival. The mining equipment market emerged more concentrated, more standardized, and less competitive in the wake of the deal. By the time the Caterpillar logo replaced Bucyrus branding on mine sites worldwide, the outcome was already settled. A century-old manufacturer was no longer an independent force, not because customers rejected it, but because the market structure no longer allowed it to exist separately. The story of Bucyrus International is not one of decline, but of absorption. Bought at peak relevance, integrated at speed, and erased as a competitor, it became a case study in how consolidation can quietly remove alternatives without ever triggering dramatic collapse. The machines remained. The name did not. Komatsu, the trade war that almost worked. The emergence of Komatsu as a global challenger to Caterpillar Inc. marked one of the most intense industrial rivalries of the late 20th century. Unlike smaller competitors that collapsed under Caterpillar's scale, Komatsu pursued a deliberate confrontation strategy built on cost efficiency, export volume, and state-aligned industrial policy. This approach triggered what industry analysts later described as a trade war rather than a conventional market competition. Komatsu's rise was inseparable from Japan's post-war economic structure. During the 1960s and 1970s, Japanese heavy industry benefited from coordinated government support, long-term industrial planning, and protection from foreign competition at home. Komatsu used this environment to refine manufacturing processes, reduce defects, and lower unit costs. By the late 1970s, the company began exporting bulldozers and excavators at prices that directly undercut Caterpillar in international markets. Caterpillar interpreted this expansion as a threat not just to profits, but to market control. Throughout the 1980s, Caterpillar accused Komatsu of dumping equipment below cost and benefiting from unfair state subsidies. These accusations were not limited to trade journals. Caterpillar executives publicly lobbied the United States government, framing the issue as an industrial survival conflict rather than normal competition. Heavy machinery became entangled with national trade policy. Political pressure followed. Investigations into Japanese imports were launched, and trade negotiations increasingly referenced construction equipment. Caterpillar emphasized domestic employment and manufacturing, positioning itself as a symbol of American industrial strength. Komatsu, rather than retreating, adapted. The company began investing in manufacturing facilities outside Japan, including plants in the United States, reducing exposure to tariffs and weakening claims of unfair foreign advantage. Operationally, Komatsu adopted a strategy of direct equivalence. Instead of disruptive innovation, it mirrored Caterpillar's product lineup closely. Bulldozers, loaders, and excavators were released in comparable size classes, often at lower prices. This approach appealed to cost-sensitive buyers, particularly in developing markets and state-funded projects where procurement budgets were limited. However, Komatsu encountered structural resistance. Caterpillar's dominance was reinforced by its dealer network, parts logistics, and financing arms. Customers purchasing heavy equipment were not buying machines alone, but long-term service ecosystems. Switching suppliers carried operational risk, retraining costs, and parts incompatibility. As a result, Komatsu often entered fleets as a secondary supplier rather than a replacement. Labor conflict amplified pressure on Caterpillar during this period. Prolonged strikes in the 1980s disrupted production and damaged public perception. Komatsu capitalized quietly, expanding output while Caterpillar faced internal instability. Market share gains followed, but they remained incremental rather than decisive. At the same time, Komatsu faced internal constraints that limited how far the trade war could escalate. Rapid overseas expansion strained management oversight, while profit margins remained thinner than Caterpillar's due to sustained low pricing. Dealer networks outside Asia struggled with parts availability and long-term servicing commitments, weakening customer confidence for high-risk projects. In several regions, early Komatsu machines suffered from perception gaps, where reliability improvements lagged behind reputation. These weaknesses did not erase Komatsu's progress, but they slowed momentum at the exact moment decisive displacement would have been required. By the early 1990s, the trade war reached an impasse. Komatsu had succeeded in establishing itself as a permanent global competitor, particularly in Asia and parts of Europe. Yet Caterpillar retained dominance in mining, large construction projects, and government contracts. Regulatory bodies declined to impose lasting trade restrictions, arguing that competition still existed. The conflict exposed a critical reality of the heavy equipment industry. Price competition alone could not overcome entrenched distribution control, political insulation, and life cycle dependency. Even with manufacturing efficiency and government alignment, Komatsu could not fully displace a company embedded across financing, servicing, and regulatory frameworks. The trade war almost worked. It reshaped pricing, forced Caterpillar to globalize further, and ended the illusion of unchallenged American dominance. But it stopped short of structural change. The market adjusted rather than transformed, leaving Caterpillar intact and Komatsu constrained within defined limits. The rivalry demonstrated that in capital-intensive industries, survival is determined less by engineering than by systems of control. Komatsu proved competition was possible. It did not prove it was enough. Euclid Trucks, the acquisition that killed competition. The downfall of Euclid Trucks did not come from technical failure or declining demand, but from acquisition. For decades, Euclid had been one of the most serious competitors in the off-highway haul truck market, supplying massive vehicles to mines and construction projects worldwide. Its trucks were widely regarded as robust, reliable, and, most importantly, an alternative to Caterpillar in a market where choice was already narrowing. Euclid's origins stretched back to the 1930s, and by the post-war period the company had established itself as a leader in heavy haulage. Euclid trucks were used extensively in mining, dam construction, and large earth-moving projects, particularly during the global infrastructure expansion of the 1950s and 1960s. At a time when Caterpillar dominated bulldozers and loaders, Euclid held a strong position in large haul trucks, creating a rare zone of sustained competition. This balance changed in 1953, when General Motors acquired Euclid. Initially, the purchase appeared neutral. GM sought to expand into heavy equipment, while Euclid gained access to capital and manufacturing scale. For several years, Euclid continued producing trucks under its own name, and competition with Caterpillar persisted, though increasingly constrained by corporate oversight. The decisive shift came in 1959, when the United States Department of Justice forced GM to divest Euclid on antitrust grounds. Regulators concluded that GM's ownership of both Euclid and Terex created excessive concentration in the heavy equipment market. Euclid was sold to White Motor Company, a move intended to restore competition. Instead, it marked the beginning of Euclid's decline. White lacked GM's capital depth and long-term commitment to heavy equipment. Investment slowed, research budgets were reduced, and Euclid's product development began to lag behind Caterpillar's rapid expansion. While Caterpillar aggressively refined dealer networks, financing, and parts logistics, Euclid struggled to maintain production consistency and global support. The final blow came in 1977, when Caterpillar Inc. acquired Euclid's remaining assets. The purchase was framed as a rational consolidation, but its consequences were immediate. Euclid's truck lines were discontinued or absorbed, factories were closed, and the Euclid name was erased from the market entirely. What had once been a primary competitor vanished almost overnight. For customers, the impact was severe. Mining operators who had relied on Euclid as leverage in negotiations suddenly faced a reduced field of suppliers. With Euclid gone, Caterpillar gained greater control over pricing, parts supply, and service terms in the haul truck segment. Switching costs rose, and fleet standardization increasingly favored Caterpillar equipment, reinforcing long-term dependency. The acquisition also had broader industry effects. Smaller manufacturers were discouraged from entering the ultra-class haul truck market, recognizing the difficulty of surviving against a company willing to acquire and eliminate competitors outright. Innovation slowed as competitive pressure decreased, with incremental improvements replacing disruptive alternatives. Labor and regional economies suffered as well. Euclid manufacturing facilities supported thousands of skilled workers, many of whom lost jobs following closures and restructuring. These losses were not offset by equivalent Caterpillar expansion in the same regions. Decisions were driven by efficiency and market dominance rather than preserving industrial diversity. Regulatory response was minimal. Although earlier antitrust action had forced GM's divestment, Caterpillar's acquisition faced little resistance. Regulators argued that global competition still existed, citing foreign manufacturers and theoretical market entry. Critics countered that such analysis ignored the realities of heavy equipment markets, where scale, service infrastructure, and installed base created barriers far beyond legal definitions. The disappearance of Euclid demonstrated how competition can be eliminated without illegal behavior. Through sequential acquisitions, weakened ownership, and strategic timing, a viable rival was removed from the market. There was no dramatic collapse, no technological failure, and no customer revolt. Competition simply ended. Euclid Trucks did not lose because it built inferior machines. It lost because ownership changes stripped it of independence, investment, and strategic direction until acquisition became inevitable. In the history of heavy equipment, Euclid stands as a cautionary example of how consolidation, even when legal, can permanently reshape markets. The acquisition did not just remove a brand, it removed a counterweight. And once that counterweight disappeared, the haul truck market never fully recovered its balance. Allis-Chalmers, when scale became a death sentence. For much of the 20th century, Allis-Chalmers was not a minor player in heavy equipment, but one of the largest industrial firms in the United States. Its portfolio spanned agricultural tractors, construction machinery, power generation, and industrial components. This breadth was once considered a strength. Over time, it became a liability that the company could not escape as markets consolidated and competitors focused more narrowly. Allis-Chalmers rose to prominence during the early 20th century by supplying machinery critical to electrification, farming, and infrastructure. By the 1950s and 1960s, its tractors and construction equipment were widely used across North America. Unlike competitors that specialized, Allis-Chalmers attempted to compete everywhere at once. This strategy required enormous capital, constant reinvestment, and coordination across unrelated divisions, leaving little margin for error. The problems intensified during the 1970s. Inflation, rising interest rates, and increased global competition placed pressure on industrial manufacturers. Japanese and European firms entered equipment markets with lower costs and more efficient production. At the same time, Caterpillar Inc. consolidated its dominance in construction and mining by narrowing focus and strengthening dealer networks. Allis-Chalmers, spread across too many sectors, could not respond with equal force. Labor conflict further weakened the company. Prolonged strikes during the 1970s disrupted production and damaged customer confidence. While competitors shifted manufacturing or leveraged global supply chains, Allis-Chalmers remained tied to costly domestic operations. Equipment deliveries slowed, contracts were lost, and dealers began drifting toward more reliable suppliers. Once dealer trust eroded, recovery became increasingly difficult. Financial strain followed. Allis-Chalmers carried heavy debt from maintaining multiple divisions, each requiring capital investment to stay competitive. Profitable segments were forced to subsidize underperforming ones, masking deeper structural problems. Rather than shrinking strategically, the company attempted to maintain scale, believing size alone would preserve relevance. This decision proved fatal as margins collapsed. The agricultural downturn of the early 1980s delivered a decisive blow. Farm equipment sales declined sharply, eliminating one of Allis-Chalmers' core revenue streams. Competitors with stronger balance sheets absorbed the shock. Allis-Chalmers did not. Cash flow deteriorated rapidly, forcing asset sales that weakened the company further. Construction equipment divisions were sold off, reducing scale without reducing debt proportionally. Attempts at restructuring came too late. By the mid-1980s, Allis-Chalmers was no longer competing as a unified industrial force. Key assets were sold to rivals or spun off as independent entities. In agriculture, its tractor business was sold to Deutz AG, ending the Allis-Chalmers name in farming. In construction, remaining product lines disappeared into competitors' portfolios. Customers felt the consequences immediately. Fleets standardized around surviving manufacturers, reducing equipment diversity. Parts availability for Allis-Chalmers machines declined, accelerating abandonment of existing equipment. Dealers who once relied on Allis-Chalmers shifted allegiance permanently, reinforcing market concentration among fewer dominant firms. What disappeared with Allis-Chalmers was not merely a brand, but competitive pressure across multiple industrial sectors at once. Its exit removed an integrated manufacturer capable of challenging pricing, dealer leverage, and supplier dominance simultaneously. The market did not replace that pressure organically. Instead, remaining firms inherited customers, infrastructure, and negotiating power without earning them through direct competition. Regulatory frameworks offered no protection. Antitrust enforcement focused on individual transactions rather than cumulative market outcomes. The dismantling of Allis-Chalmers was viewed as market correction rather than competitive loss. No intervention addressed the shrinking number of independent manufacturers capable of challenging industry leaders. The collapse also carried broader implications. Thousands of skilled workers lost jobs as factories closed or were sold. Communities built around Allis-Chalmers plants experienced long-term economic decline. These costs were externalized, treated as unavoidable consequences of industrial change rather than the result of strategic miscalculation and unchecked consolidation. Allis-Chalmers did not fail because it lacked technology or customers. It failed because scale without focus became unsustainable in an industry moving toward specialization and control of distribution. The very size that once signaled strength prevented rapid adaptation when conditions changed. In the end, Allis-Chalmers was not crushed by a single competitor. It was exhausted by attempting to compete everywhere at once while rivals chose battles selectively. When scale became a substitute for strategy, it turned into a death sentence. The company's disappearance reduced competition across multiple sectors, leaving markets narrower and more concentrated than before. Liebherr versus Caterpillar, the one rival that refused to collapse. For more than half a century, Liebherr has occupied a unique position in the global heavy equipment industry. While many competitors were absorbed, marginalized, or eliminated by Caterpillar Inc., Liebherr remained independent. This survival was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate strategic choices that allowed Liebherr to coexist with Caterpillar without submitting to its dominance. Liebherr was founded in 1949 in post-war Germany, initially focusing on tower cranes rather than earth-moving machinery. This origin mattered. By avoiding direct early competition with Caterpillar's core products, Liebherr built technical expertise in lifting and material handling, sectors that demanded precision engineering rather than mass scale. The company expanded gradually, reinvesting profits instead of pursuing rapid global dominance. When Liebherr entered earth-moving equipment in the 1960s and 1970s, it did so selectively. Rather than mirroring Caterpillar's entire product lineup, Liebherr concentrated on specific niches where engineering specialization could outweigh scale. Hydraulic excavators, mining shovels, and large cranes became core strengths. These machines were complex, expensive, and less dependent on dealer saturation, limiting Caterpillar's usual advantages. Caterpillar's model relied heavily on global dealer networks, standardized part systems, and life cycle control. Liebherr rejected this structure. It retained direct control over manufacturing, sales, and service in many regions, especially in Europe. This reduced dependence on independent dealers and insulated the company from pricing pressure imposed through distribution dominance. The trade-off was slower expansion, but also greater autonomy. Price competition between the two companies was asymmetric. Caterpillar often competed aggressively on volume and financing, leveraging scale to undercut smaller rivals. Liebherr refused to follow. Its machines were frequently more expensive up front, justified through performance, durability, and specialized application. This strategy filtered customers. Liebherr equipment was adopted where switching costs were already high and performance failures carried severe consequences, such as large-scale mining and port operations. Caterpillar attempted repeatedly to encroach on Liebherr's strongest segments. In mining, Caterpillar expanded shovel and haul truck offerings, especially after acquiring Bucyrus. Liebherr responded by doubling down on vertical integration, producing its own engines, hydraulics, and control systems. This reduced supplier dependency and limited Caterpillar's ability to pressure shared supply chains. Unlike rivals that overextended, Liebherr maintained conservative growth. It remained privately owned, avoiding shareholder pressure for short-term returns. This allowed long investment horizons and tolerance for slower expansion cycles. During industry downturns, Liebherr could absorb losses without selling divisions or abandoning markets, something publicly traded competitors often could not do. The relationship between the two companies was competitive but constrained. Liebherr rarely challenged Caterpillar in mass-market construction equipment. Caterpillar, in turn, struggled to displace Liebherr in specialized heavy lifting and high-precision excavation. The rivalry settled into an uneasy coexistence rather than a zero-sum war. Regulatory environments also played a role. Liebherr's European base placed it within different competition frameworks than Caterpillar's American stronghold. While not immune to scrutiny, Liebherr benefited from operating across multiple jurisdictions without dominating any single one. This reduced the likelihood of antitrust pressure while maintaining operational flexibility. Operational culture further differentiated the companies. Caterpillar prioritized standardization and global uniformity. Liebherr emphasized engineering autonomy across divisions. Subsidiaries operated with significant independence, allowing faster adaptation to local requirements. This structure resisted the bureaucratic inertia that often accompanied scale. The result was endurance rather than conquest. Liebherr did not defeat Caterpillar. It survived Caterpillar. In an industry where consolidation eliminated alternatives, survival itself became a form of resistance. Customers retained at least one credible option outside Caterpillar's ecosystem for high-end applications. Liebherr's refusal to collapse challenged the assumption that scale alone determines survival in heavy equipment. By avoiding overreach, rejecting mass-market battles, and protecting independence, the company preserved relevance where others vanished. Its continued existence demonstrated that Caterpillar's dominance, while vast, was not absolute. In the end, Liebherr succeeded not by confronting Caterpillar everywhere, but by choosing where not to fight. That restraint, combined with engineering depth and structural independence, allowed it to remain standing while others disappeared. In a landscape shaped by consolidation, Liebherr became the exception that proved resistance was possible. Dealer networks, how distribution became a weapon. In the heavy equipment industry, competition has rarely been decided solely by engineering. Machines can be copied, specifications matched, and prices undercut. What proved far harder to challenge was distribution. Over decades, Caterpillar Incorporated transformed its dealer network into a strategic weapon, one that shaped markets, constrained rivals, and quietly determined which manufacturers survived. Caterpillar began building its dealer system in the early 20th century, long before most competitors recognized distribution as a source of power. Rather than treating dealers as interchangeable sales outlets, Caterpillar made them exclusive partners. Dealers were granted protected territories, long-term contracts, and deep integration into Caterpillar's parts, financing, and service systems. In exchange, they committed to selling Caterpillar equipment almost exclusively. This exclusivity created structural lock-in. Contractors and mining companies did not simply buy machines. They bought access to parts warehouses, field mechanics, financing options, and emergency repair coverage. Once a fleet was standardized around Caterpillar equipment, switching manufacturers became risky and expensive. A rival machine failure could halt an entire operation if local support was unavailable. Competitors underestimated this advantage. Many focused on building better or cheaper machines, assuming customers would follow performance. But performance mattered less when downtime costs exceeded purchase price differences. Caterpillar dealers stocked parts locally, dispatched technicians rapidly, and offered financing that bundled machines with long-term service agreements. Rivals struggled to replicate this infrastructure without comparable scale. Dealer loyalty was actively enforced. Manufacturers attempting to enter Caterpillar-dominated regions often found potential dealers unwilling to carry competing brands. Selling a rival's equipment risked losing Caterpillar authorization, which for many dealerships meant financial collapse. This created a chilling effect. Even capable competitors faced closed distribution channels before their machines ever reached customers. The system also influenced pricing power. With limited alternatives available through established dealers, Caterpillar could maintain higher margins. Customers negotiating prices knew that walking away meant sacrificing service reliability. Dealers reinforced this leverage by emphasizing long-term ownership costs rather than upfront price, framing Caterpillar equipment as the safer choice regardless of initial expense. International expansion followed the same model. As Caterpillar entered emerging markets, it established dealer networks early, often before demand fully materialized. This preemptive presence blocked competitors from securing local distribution. When rival manufacturers later attempted entry, they faced fragmented or inexperienced dealer options, undermining customer confidence. Even strong challengers felt the pressure. Komatsu, despite manufacturing efficiency and competitive pricing, struggled to match Caterpillar's service depth outside core markets. Komatsu invested heavily in building its own dealer networks, but progress was slow and uneven. In many regions, Caterpillar's entrenched dealers retained loyalty regardless of machine performance comparisons. The dealer system also shaped acquisitions. When Caterpillar absorbed competitors, their dealer networks were either dismantled or folded into the Caterpillar structure. This eliminated parallel service ecosystems and reinforced market concentration. Customers lost alternative support channels, even if machines technically remained available. Regulators largely ignored distribution dominance. Antitrust scrutiny focused on manufacturing share and pricing, not on dealer exclusivity or life cycle dependency. As a result, Caterpillar's most powerful advantage operated outside traditional regulatory definitions of monopoly behavior. The market appeared competitive on paper, while functioning as a controlled ecosystem in practice. For smaller manufacturers, the barrier proved fatal. Without dealers capable of offering comprehensive support, sales stalled. Machines sat unsold not because they failed technically, but because customers feared isolation after purchase. Over time, these firms exited markets or sold themselves to larger players, accelerating consolidation. The transformation of dealer networks into a competitive weapon reshaped the industry permanently. Success was no longer determined by who built the best machine, but by who controlled access to service, parts, and trust. Distribution became strategy, and strategy became exclusion. Caterpillar did not need to crush rivals openly. By owning the pathways between factory and job site, it defined the terms of competition itself. In heavy equipment, the battlefield was not the machine yard, but the dealer network. Once that was secured, the outcome was often decided before competition even began. Antitrust investigations. Why Caterpillar walked away, unpunished. For decades, Caterpillar Incorporated operated under repeated scrutiny without ever facing consequences that meaningfully altered its dominance. While competitors collapsed, merged, or disappeared, Caterpillar continued expanding through acquisitions, dealer control, and market leverage. The absence of serious antitrust penalties was not accidental. It reflected how regulators defined competition, how evidence was evaluated, and how power in heavy industry was structurally misunderstood. Antitrust attention toward Caterpillar emerged periodically throughout the late 20th century, particularly during moments of consolidation. Regulators examined acquisitions, dealer exclusivity, and pricing behavior. On paper, Caterpillar often appeared compliant. Market share calculations were segmented narrowly by product category, geography, or equipment class, allowing Caterpillar to argue that competition still existed in each defined segment. This narrow definition of markets proved decisive. Heavy equipment is not interchangeable like consumer goods. A mining truck, bulldozer, or excavator operates within long life cycles, specialized infrastructure, and service ecosystems. Regulators, however, focused on unit sales and nominal competitors rather than functional dependency. As long as another manufacturer existed somewhere on the chart, dominance was dismissed as theoretical. Dealer networks were almost entirely ignored. Antitrust law focused on manufacturing concentration, not distribution control. Caterpillar's exclusive dealer arrangements, territorial protections, and service bundling were framed as efficiency rather than exclusion. Regulators treated dealers as independent businesses rather than extensions of corporate strategy. This allowed Caterpillar's most powerful control mechanism to remain untouched. When complaints were raised by customers or competitors, they were often dismissed as market outcomes rather than anti-competitive conduct. High parts prices, restrictive service contracts, and limited alternatives were framed as consequences of scale, not abuse of power. Regulators required proof of intent to exclude competitors directly, a standard difficult to meet in industries where pressure operates indirectly. International investigations followed similar patterns. European and other authorities reviewed Caterpillar's behavior but struggled with jurisdictional fragmentation. Caterpillar operated across dozens of countries, each with separate regulatory thresholds. No single authority could assess cumulative global effects. As a result, scrutiny remained localized and incomplete, allowing systemic dominance to persist. Political considerations also played a role. Caterpillar positioned itself as a national industrial champion, employing tens of thousands and exporting American machinery worldwide. Aggressive enforcement risked economic backlash, job losses, and political pressure. Regulators were reluctant to intervene in ways that could be framed as harming domestic industry, particularly during periods of economic uncertainty. The complexity of heavy equipment markets further insulated Caterpillar. Antitrust cases require clear narratives for courts and policymakers. The layered nature of equipment life cycles, dealer relationships, financing, and parts logistics made harm difficult to communicate succinctly. While competitors disappeared, causation remained diffuse. Consolidation occurred through sequences rather than single events, obscuring accountability. Past enforcement actions reinforced this pattern. Earlier antitrust interventions, such as forcing divestitures in adjacent industries, failed to prevent later reconsolidation. Regulators grew cautious, favoring minimal intervention over structural remedies. Behavioral commitments replaced breakups, allowing companies to comply formally while preserving core advantages. The result was regulatory normalization of dominance. Caterpillar did not need to violate laws overtly. It operated within frameworks designed for faster-moving, less capital-intensive industries. By the time harm became visible, markets had already restructured. Competition could not be restored without dismantling entire ecosystems, a step regulators were unwilling to take. Critics argued that enforcement focused on snapshots rather than trajectories. Caterpillar's power grew through accumulation, not sudden monopolization. Each acquisition, contract, or dealer agreement appeared defensible in isolation. Together, they eliminated alternatives. Antitrust frameworks were not designed to address this form of gradual enclosure. Caterpillar walked away unpunished because the rules were not written for companies like it. Heavy equipment markets reward longevity, integration, and inertia. Regulators measured competition by presence, not viability. As long as a rival existed somewhere, dominance was tolerated. In the end, Caterpillar did not defeat antitrust law, it outgrew it. By operating in the gaps between definitions, jurisdictions, and political realities, the company preserved its position while scrutiny dissolved into paperwork. The investigations came and went. The structure remained unchanged.